Good morning, and thanks for having me and us, one of several interlopers from out west. I am Chris Ritchie, and I work for the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resources Operation, where I'm currently the manager of Fish and Wildlife Recovery Implementation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan that the Government of BC has recently adopted and is starting to implement. I thought Stephen would give a little breather between Dave and I, because there's a lot of same old you're about to hear here. So I'm not sure if he's brilliant and we're following him or vice versa. Yeah, exactly. So a brief introduction, some of the history that led us to the management plan that was recently announced. Then I'm going to talk about some of the elements within that plan and how we hope to be able to deliver them to reach some success in meeting the management objectives for caribou, and then some of the next steps. So just as context, Boreal Caribou, we have lots of caribou in British Columbia, all the same species, 3 different ecotypes, but Boreal Caribou are situated in the northeast corner. We categorize them in 6 different herd areas. They range currently, or at least 2010, the best numbers, from several hundreds to several dozens. Some of that is the nature of the range area. They're just small ranges. Some of it is the current state of the habitat and what those animals will what the habitats will support. The situation that Dave described, Alberta and Canada, is similar in BC. Typically the populations are declining. They're driven by habitat disturbance because of human activities. That has led to changes in predator-prey dynamics, and everybody's on the decline. That was one of the incentives for BC to do something. The emerging federal national recovery strategy was another pressure for BC to get on with it, get a Made in BC stamp, and actually get out and do something to deliver some works on the ground. So that led to some work to try and develop some scenarios, the art of the possible, I suppose. And Steve Wilson, who will talk tomorrow, I believe, had a key hand in some of the modeling that was undertaken. But we modeled some of the potentials out there, and they range from a full moratorium, turn out the lights tomorrow, and have no more industrial development. That model, and there was a fair bit of uncertainty with the modeling, but it still led to a decline in caribou populations and some probability of extirpation of 2 of the ranges. So that still was not a panacea in BC. What if we halted the disposition of any new tenures but let the existing issued ones ride? Again, the model suggests about a 50% decline in the 6 herds up there and the possible extinction of 3 of them. And so if we let business as usual, don't do anything for caribou other than what's happening, it's likely we would see extirpation in somebody's lifetime anyway of caribou in Boreal Caribou, BC, except for the Max Hamish range, which is the most westerly range, the one that has currently had the least impact from human endeavors. Modeling also explored some other things we could do rather than just put aside habitat. It seems, again, there are some uncertainties with the conclusion, but restoring habitat could provide a significant improvement on some of the trajectory, some of the prognosis for these herds. We need to explore that and see how effective that would be and how it would offset some of the impacts to the footprint. So that's not a very good news story to take to senior officials, but we did. And in late 2009 and in 2010, the government senior officials supported or endorsed the Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan. And it had 2 major goals. The first was to decrease the expected rate of decline. As I say, with a complete moratorium, the trajectory is still downward, at least for the immediate term. So let's reduce the steepness of that trajectory. And over a long term, significantly reduce the risk of extirpation of 4 of those 5 herds. 50 years seems like a long time, but that seems reasonable to accommodate some of the industrial activity in the caribou ranges, and makes a long-term commitment to at least 4 of those ranges. So how are we going to achieve those goals? There are, again, objectives similar to the ones that Dave went through. We want to try and protect sufficient habitat to permit the recovery in those 6 ranges, ideally, in the long term. So there are some tools in here that I'll talk about deferring habitat from alienation to industrial use. We want to try and recruit habitat into a more suitable condition, so that's AKA habitat restoration. We also want to manage the size of the footprint, again, an element in the discussion that Dave presented, so that we minimize the loss of habitat in real time. And we want to mitigate the effects of that industrial footprint. So not just the stamp on the ground, but the stuff you get with it, whether it's disturbance associated with linear developments, some of the change in the predator-prey dynamics, a variety of elements. And again, we want to try and monitor the effectiveness of management actions and then try and modify them so that we achieve some of the population and distribution goals and objectives. I really enjoy the adaptive management comment. I hate that term. Nobody does adaptive management, and yet we throw it out all the time. Shame on you.
Okay.
I know, and you admit it. So we recognize, as Dave did, that all herds currently are not created equal, and so we are not going to deploy those 4 or 5 or 6 tools in the same way. Now, we're not going to be as structured to tease out what's going on, but some places, like in the Calendar Range, have a long history of development, have a lot of legacy impact, and so provide a lot of opportunity for at least potentially habitat restoration. We're going to still manage the footprint, but a lot of the footprinting in that range has been done. The opposite end of the continuum probably is in the Max Hamish, the area that has had the least development to date, but is the one that is emerging as the new play. Not much opportunity for restoration, so we won't spend much time there doing that, but probably the best opportunity to minimize the footprint in a real-time way so that we have less need for that when that industrial activity starts to wind down. You may be able to see these numbers. These are the modeled projections over 50 years where we hope to be when industrial activity starts to wind down and we start to lose less habitat because it's done. The ranges contribute to about 500 or so animals. We hope to have them in at least 100 or more, populations of 100 or more in 4 of those range areas. Some of them, according to the model right now, and granted there's some uncertainty, but the prognosis is not terribly good. So, unfortunately, I should have brought a paper map to illustrate some of the bits and pieces we're going to do on the ground, and I don't usually need a mic. So we are going to defer some areas in the resource review areas, which is this green hatch, and they are unevenly distributed throughout the caribou ranges. We are going to have ungulate winter ranges and wildlife habitat areas, core habitat areas that are managed differently from some of the other ranges. And it illustrates where the range is, so caribou walk around in here, and the core areas, which are the green and the darker yellow, which have a higher value for something, winter use or calving or what have you. So we are, similar to Dave, we're going to do basically lots of everything everywhere, but even within those ranges, we're going to focus somewhat differentially within them. So resource review areas, that's the deferral tool. So to set aside some ground. These were identified as being within caribou range and currently untenured. So nobody loses anything by alienating these areas for 5 years from disposition of oil and gas tenures. A light came on after we did this that, well, maybe we should put a similar constraint on other stuff so that a logging block or a large frac sand pit doesn't sort of undo what we're doing beneficially from the oil and gas sector. These are going to be a landscape element, big chunks of ground. There are 550,000 hectares. That seems like a lot of ground, but we got a big country up there. And they hopefully will complement some of the site-specific things that we'll talk about in a bit. They have a 5-year life. They might provide some opportunities to sort of test and learn from innovation. So maybe we'll have some opportunities here for real adaptive management. And we want to, within 5 years from their inception, analyze them against specific performance measures to see how well they're doing. Do we replace them as is, where is? Do we move them? Do we abandon ship because they're just not working? So that's one of the elements. We also identified polygons of wildlife habitat. These are more important areas, core areas. There's lots of ways to describe them. We use two pieces of legislation in BC. I'm sorry for the acronyms, but the Forest and Range Practices Act just fills a slide. That's FERPA. And the Oil and Gas Activities Act. That allows my sister or brother agency, the Ministry of Environment, to identify and legally establish polygons. Spatial blobs on the ground that reflect something special for caribou in this case. They are built on science and knowledge, whether that is telemetry information, surveys, some modeling, and they are identified for purpose. So there's really only two main purposes, and I'll talk about them in a bit, calving and wintering, but they do have a specific intent involved, and we're going to manage to achieving that intent. And the conundrum is we want them to be stable so that there's certainty on the ground, so that industry knows where they can do what, and we can assure some of the folks, First Nations, NGOs, that we have a plan out there. But we also want the schizophrenia of being flexible, so that as we have more research, knowledge, or what have you, we can tailor these things. So we hope we're not going to holus-bolus throw them around and mangle them, but they are likely going to change over the 50-year life that we see for this plan. So as I said, there's two areas, one typically called a wildlife habitat area for calving. The objectives are predator avoidance, so a cow-calf pair does not get eaten. We want to try and avoid the disturbance of that pair so that they don't get separated and lose that bond. And a girl's got to eat while she's there. And the ungulate winter range is pretty evident from the term for winter use. Objectives are similar, but the main focus is going to be on food, followed by predator avoidance, and then also reduce the energy demand on the animals while they're there. So those are the blobs on the ground, the spatial certainty that we can establish through legislation. But you need to have certain rules or directions or guidelines applied to them. So we achieve those in BC in two different ways. We want to have measures that address the specific impacts from the operator. And so we recognize that forestry is not the same as oil and gas, and so we're going to have different sorts of rules, again, heading towards a similar end. And in the forestry realm, we have things called general wildlife measures, or GWIMs, and they apply to forest tenure holders. We're bureaucrats. We put everybody in their own little box and put different rules on them. And they are established by government, by the Ministry of Environment, or my agency now, and they are known beforehand. You can go to a web page and find in this polygon under FERPA the rules of the road. And whilst there are exceptions, those are the rules you're expected to follow, and you know them a priori. And the GWIMs speak to road development, to timber harvesting, to silviculture regimes, and some of their recreational trails. So on the oil and gas side, a different legislation that gives us a different opportunity. We developed what we've called operating practices. A group involving industry and government examined the activities typical of the sector, how they would impact some of the values to caribou, and developed, after much consternation and discussion, a thing called operating practices. These guidelines, which were conveyed by the Minister of Environment to the Oil and Gas Commission, are the general expectations for caribou management on site-specific activities, so not big access management things, but this well site or that seismic program. And they are to apply to oil and gas tenure holders when they submit an application. So you sort of know what's going on before you develop your plan, but you can't tell exactly what the rules are going to be. Because the Oil and Gas Commission, which has the statutory authority to apply to regulate the sector, needs to avoid material adverse impacts. That's the language in the legislation for activities that are undertaken in these specified areas, these polygons for wildlife, either WHAs or UWRs. That's the regulatory test. So a permit application comes in, it's in a polygon, it's for this intent. They refer to the operating practices figure out which ones are going to be appropriate and effective, and they are converted to permit conditions, which is where a legal requirement is applied. Then there's an expectation that the industrial operator will meet those objectives. We have operating practices, again, different from forestry, for seismic and geophysical, trying to reduce barriers from pipes, trying to concentrate wells onto pads, and things like minimizing or limiting surface disturbance. They're heading to the same place as the WIMs under FERPA. See how quickly I can slide into those letters. This is a much newer game for us, so we're still finding our way. So that's what we're doing for managing habitat beforehand. Similar to the Alberta program, we're going to try and restore some of the legacy, some of the bad old days when we had large seismic programs or big well pads or whatever it is. We also want to try and keep on top of the real time, the recent stuff. So that as a well pad under development has to be big and then it can be smaller when it's operating, we want to try and restore that habitat as quickly as possible. We're pretty new at this, and so we think we will be trying to establish forage for caribou. We think we will try to not establish forage for alternate prey that might affect predator-prey dynamics. And we also think we're going to probably try and restore habitat so it reduces predator efficiency. So my favorite example is maybe habitat restoration is put up a snow fence on a seismic line so a wolf can't see down that line. It's probably going to be a little more sophisticated than that. Another issue that we're dealing with is site remediation. What happens when we have a spill or something and the site gets contaminated? Huge interest for First Nations on this side. It'll be a ticklish thing where where contamination is affecting caribou recovery. It can probably be captured in some of this restoration, but there's a plethora of other problems with contamination, and we're going to, within our mandate and our resourcing, need to try and avoid those because it's a huge potential task that my agency, again, the bureaucracy, the box that I'm in, we can't deal with very effectively. As Dave mentioned, predator-prey management. Predation is a limiting factor for caribou basically everywhere, and it includes the boreal in British Columbia. There's a variety of potential culprits, but wolves are typically the one that floats to the top, and we want to make sure that's the case in BC. And we're likely going to look for opportunities where we can apply wolf control measures that release the pressure that is constraining recovery. So we, as we're often accused of doing, don't want to just go out and kill wolves because that's what we do. We want to ensure that we couple a cause and effect, and we need quite a few steps before we can get there, quite frankly. We also, similar to Dave, want to examine some of these alternate prey, and whether it's moose or deer up in that part of BC, beaver may be another protein supply for wolves that we need to figure out how to manage, and there may be other stuff out there. Again, we're a little bit new at this, and so we're going to have to figure out the dealio. And finally, I suppose, the treatment that we come up with, whether it's for prey or the predators directly, is going to need to be framed within this strategy that is specific to the boreal landscape. One of my other hats is on mountain caribou, the critters that run the rocks adjacent to the national parks down to the U.S. border. We've been trying to find a way to control wolves in that landscape for much longer than the boreal. We still don't have permission to do it, and we're pretty sure that maybe some of the principles there can be applied in the boreal, but we can't pick up whatever that tool is in a situation where caribou use deep snow to get to tree lichen in a place where they're out in the muskeg doing other things. So we need to be careful of not knee-jerking and just grabbing a tool that may disappoint us. Monitoring and inventory, again, similar to Dave, it will be a collaborative effort. We might even collaborate with Alberta, God help us, because you've got all the money, by the way. But this will be an effort that involves government, a variety of agencies, with First Nations and with industry. We hope to build on some of the existing inventory efforts. I'm not sure that we've been managing Boreal Caribou since the 80s in northeast BC, but we have been doing quite a bit of effort in the last 5 or so years. So we want to build on some of the calf surveys, the population surveys. We're also going to have to expand our view a bit to figure out how to manage the progress on restoration. We're going to try some stuff, and this is maybe small A adaptive management, and see, did that work? Well, we'll use that one, and that one didn't, so let's see why it didn't work and then improve from it. And also this issue, the proximal issue on managing predators. It's going to be a tough socio-political challenge to get approval to kill wolves, so we better be effective. We better know that it is effective if we're going to want to continue it. And as I mentioned, the resource review areas need specific performance measures because they represent a pretty significant constraint on the industry, and we need to be sure that those areas, the deferral areas, are being effective. Associated with monitoring and inventory is research. Similar to what Dave said, is we want to focus on some of the key limitations of knowledge. There's probably lots of stuff, although there's lots of stuff on caribou, we know there's lots of opportunities to do more, but where are the key gaps? And so I think that's, perhaps not today, but tomorrow will help us walk towards that place. And we want to, within those key gaps, focus on the known, and my famous American politician Rumsfeld, what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know, we don't know. We want to understand the limitations to recovery and focus on those. So if we think predation is the big deal, and there's some key holes in our understanding, let's focus the time and effort on those gaps so that we can be stepping up more quickly than a more scattered research program. So nearly lastly, the next steps, we need to, on the BC side, engage interested First Nations. I get to try and stick handle that, to go to communities and say, here's the BC plan, the Boreal Caribou implementation plan. What do you think, and where do you think you're interested enough to be a partner, to be a participant? How can we better reflect your interests? We need to develop some of the committees, I use that term loosely, that will help drive forward what we're going to do for restoration, what we're going to do for predator-prey management, and some of the science aspects. Those are all in very early stages of development. And I know Diane's here, but we're going to need to deal with the federal processes. And so Dave mentioned the National Boreal Strategy, partly driven by a court case that was announced at the end of the summer, literally days before BC announced our implementation plan. We take, I think, some comfort or support that we can see some similarities between the draft federal plan and BC's plan, in as much as most of the herds, the herds in BC are not currently self-sustaining. They envision a long-term time frame for success and some flexibility in habitat management, because as Dave alluded, we're going to continue to have industrial development, we're going to continue to lose some habitat, and so we're going to need to be flexible in how we manage that. And if one federal process isn't enough, we have recently announced in last summer a recovery strategy for the Southern Mountains National Ecological Area. And that's everything sort of from here. So Fort St. John is here. There's some coal belt critters in here. A northern ecotype, all the mountain caribou. That process was targeted to be completed by the end of March. Good luck. In consultation with First Nations, they have determined that, in fact, it's going to take longer because the First Nations have been quite strident that they need effective engagement, not just a sort of a token level of consultation. In BC, it's complicated by having two different ecotypes, so two different styles of habitat use of the caribou. And it's going to have to figure out how to integrate some existing planning processes. The MCRIP, which is the Mountain Caribou Recovery Implementation Plan, was signed off in 2007. It's a recovery plan for that ecotype. And we've started the Peace Northern Caribou Plan for the caribou in the coal belt sort of south of Chetwynd. So those are going to have to find their ways into the efforts by the feds. And lastly, if I went too fast, you can get all this on a web page. I'll put these handy-dandy little cards at the front desk with the web page. It includes, this first document is those projected scenarios that Steve Wilson and others produced, so why we came to the conclusion we did. The actual plan itself is there, and then one of the tools, the interim operating practices that the Ministry of Environment has conveyed to the Oil and Gas Commission.